homelessness is caused by insufficient housing, and it's also an economic challenge. But then as people get into homelessness, a whole series of other challenges unfold. A lot of people are on the margin, and what we're seeing is an opportunity, is something relevant from a real estate perspective, actually opening up more ownership opportunities, opens up more rental opportunities. More people who are currently renters get into ownership. It frees up space in the rental market for a lot of people that they're at the margins anyway, and those people might become homeless to begin with.
Prominent CEOs, leading economists, iconic investors, insights from the experts. The Walker Webcast with Willy Walker. See who's next.
Good morning here in Denver, Colorado, and good afternoon to many people who are watching this live on the Walker Webcast. It's a real honor for me to be here with Egon Terplan from the Brookings Institute and Mayor Mike Johnston from Denver, Colorado, to talk about the future of cities in America and more specifically the future of Denver. Mr. Mayor, great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Egon, thank you for coming into town.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Mayor, I want to start here. You, as a relatively new mayor and coming into a very vibrant urban center almost a year ago in your current job, there were a lot of priorities. There were a lot of things that needed help. There was crime. There was back to office. There was the safety of the people in the city of Denver. There's housing issues. There's health issues. As you looked at all that and had to prioritize, if I was in that meeting with your staff in the first week with all of those things to focus on, what was the first thing? Tell us how you prioritized what to focus on, because this issue of urban revitalization post-COVID, we all sit here from a lens of, well, get people back into the office, let's get rent growth, let's get adaptive reuse of space that's not going to be used again. That's just one piece of a much broader picture that you have to look at. Yeah. So help us think about what you looked at as it relates to the priorities stepping into your job.
Yeah, I think we looked at it almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What are the things that have to be in place at each base level to drive the next level? So for us, of course, the long-term goal is how do you make downtown Denver the most vibrant downtown in the country, and that has a series of steps that include how do you think about homelessness, how do you think about crime, how do you think about placemaking, how do you think about economic development, how do you think about affordability, and I hope we'll talk about all of those in the sequence. But for us, the first step for me was captured obviously in the story where I was talking to a commercial property owner who was touring a CEO who wanted to look at space downtown, and she came up to the 12th floor, looked at all the space, loved it, was very excited. They're close to closing the deal, and she comes downstairs, and by the time she comes downstairs, the rental car she had has been broken into and all her stuff's been stolen. We don't close that deal no matter how good the offer is on the leased unit. And so we had to start at the beginning, which for us was around homelessness. We had at that point one of the fourth or fifth toughest homeless situations in the country. We had hundreds, almost thousands of tents and encampments in our city center that made folks not feel safe there, not want to return to work there. And we had people whose lives were at risk. We had more outdoor deaths in 2022 than any year before. And so our first step was to get folks off the streets and into housing, and then to close those encampments and keep them closed so we could get those streets reactivated for residents and for businesses. We undertook a very aggressive, ambitious plan to try to move 1,000 people off the streets and into housing. We've now, 1 year in, moved more than 1,900 people off the streets into housing. We've closed every one of the major 18 encampments in the city. And now for the first time in as long as I can remember, there are about 500 square blocks of downtown that do not have a single tent or a single encampment. So we started there because that was the first prerequisite to be able to invite people back. Second one was focus on crime. I have to talk about that when you're ready.
Can I pause for 2 seconds on that? Of how significant an accomplishment that is. What was your goal for year one? Because you weren't thinking you were going to get 1,900 off the street.
Our goal was 1,000 in the first 6 months. We did 1,200 in the first 6 months, and we'll be at now 2,000 over the first year. And that was, we housed more people faster than any city in America we think has done it at this stage. And the key for us was bringing on units we could bring on affordably and quickly, which were either hotel conversions or were tiny homes villages that we built. But the key was...
Are you under the same restraint that California is as it relates to having to have a bed for someone that you move off the street?
We were, and what we found was just the type of beds we were offering was not working. So when folks said, why don't people take options. When the option was, do you want to sleep in a gymnasium floor with 100 other people you don't know in the dark, people would say no. If you have an individual, what we'd call a non-congregate shelter site, where you have your own lock, your own door, your own access to shower, bathroom, kitchen, storage, you can go safely to a job for the day and come back, 100% of the folks we offered that option to took it. So that meant instead of pushing people from block to block or sweeping them from block to block, we found an encampment. We closed it. We closed it by moving everyone in that encampment to a housing option. And once we closed that option, we kept that region of the city permanently closed to future camping. So each time you do house a new encampment, you're actually expanding the concentric circles of spaces of the city that have no camping left anymore, which is why now all of our downtown is in that category of no camping.
Start a legacy. Start turning dreams into realities. A better world begins with you. Better communities start with us.
I had General David Petraeus on the Walker Webcast 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about Israel, and we were talking about Gaza, and one of the things that he was somewhat critical of the Israeli strategy is that they are basically clearing but not holding. And he was talking about Iraq when they went in on the surge, and he talked about clearing and holding, and that was the big change in the strategy. You figured that out as it relates to clear and hold, not clear and move on to the next area.
I'm smiling because the phrase we used was you have to hold the hill. Like once you eventually clear any of those places and you house people, the key is housing them first. You then have to hold those spaces and reclaim them for activation for the rest of the city. And at every stage, that's been our strategy. And we used a very unique way to integrate both nonprofit partners, private security, and our police department into an integrated response system, so that the holding is not an officer with a gun and a badge. It's a nonprofit partner with a yellow vest who walks up to someone and says, do you need services? You can't put a tent here. But that we intensely overstaffed each one of those blocks we had to hold each time. 24-hour coverage for the first 48 hours. Then you go down to 6 or 7 patrols a day. Then you go down to 1 patrol a day. Then you go down to 2 patrols a week. But originally, you have to intensely hold that space to make sure people don't return.
Egon, let me pull you in here for a second. Why is what Mayor Johnston just talked about either so challenging to do or not being done by other municipalities?
Yeah, I think this is a critical issue. Maybe just actually stepping back on homelessness for a moment before getting into the tactics in downtown. I think we have to see this very much as a national problem. And clearly, at its root, homelessness is caused by insufficient housing, and it's also an economic challenge. But then as people get into homelessness, a whole series of other challenges unfold. So I think something that you've done very well, we're talking about the tactical side once people are on the streets, but also sort of upstream a little bit, it's actually preventing people from the outset of actually getting into homelessness. And I think that becomes a strategy we need to think about as being much more affordable. Kind of allowing people to stay in the homes that they're in. A lot of people are on the margin, and what we're seeing is an opportunity, is something relevant from a real estate perspective, actually opening up more ownership opportunities, opens up more rental opportunities. More people who are currently renters get into ownership. It frees up space in the rental market for a lot of people that they're at the margins anyway, and those people might become homeless to begin with. So I just wanted to start by saying I think it's a very important and critical strategy. We all step back and try to prevent it from the outset, and then we talk about the tactics of how we manage particular
Totally
towns.
agree with that. And we focus on what I call the entire ladder of housing, right? Which is right now you literally have folks who are on the ground with not on the first rung of the ladder. They're experiencing street homelessness. You got to get them first into a transitional housing site, then into an affordable subsidized rental, then into a market rate rental, then into ownership, right? Everyone's on some version of that ladder. We have teachers and nurses and firefighters stuck on the can't get access to an affordable unit. Want to talk about, we're making, I think, also the biggest bet in the country on affordability around making sure you can keep an affordable housing stock, and also what you do upstream to prevent people from entering homelessness in the first place. So we have a rental assistance program we expanded by $20 million or more last year to try to, the simple math is, someone's behind 2 months on their rent, it costs $3,000 or $4,000 to keep them housed in that unit. It costs us $30,000 to $40,000 a year once they become homeless.
Right.
It is far better for that human being and for our city for us to keep folks housed than it is to let them become homeless.
Why doesn't the federal government understand that as it relates to housing assistance program? The cost to us as a nation to put HAP contracts out there is exactly, if you will, the math that you were just talking about as it relates to the moment someone tips from being housed to being unhoused, the cost is so exponential for us to give them services. How has that message not gotten to DC?
And as Egon says, the trauma also compounds over that time. What you find, I always say, like, think about how your drinking habits changed during COVID. I would imagine it went up dramatically for all of you. And that is a small amount of anxiety added to your life. Now think about you being homeless outdoors on the street in 10-degree weather in January in Denver with folks on either side of you who might have weapons or guns and you might be assaulted, or how would you self-medicate in those moments? The trauma compounds. So for us, the human costs get much higher and the financial costs get much higher. I think for us, the biggest challenge that we think other cities fall down at is the number of units you have to bring on have to match the scale of the problem. So in many cities, you spend 2 or 3 years having a battle to site one village of tiny homes for 40 units. When your problem is 2,000 people. We did 60 town halls that I did personally across the city in 180 days. We opened 8 sites with 1,200 units in 180 days. That's the scale at which you have to play if you want to move 1,000 people off the streets. And you get a lot of pushback from neighborhoods on that. We opened sites in neighborhoods that have never had a homeless site in them before, or a homeless shelter before. We pushed through that, delivered those units. Now those communities, I think, are much more excited about the services, but I think normally people stop because of the political pushback on the scale of units you have to bring on to solve the problem.
And is that why California can't get their hands around this?
Well, I mean, California certainly was at the front end of this going back many decades. And I think there was a confluence of both lack of supply on the one hand. I think California is sort of the national leader in not building a sufficient amount of housing to match the demand out there. And of course, going back decades, there was a variety, the shutting down of mental health hospitals and a series of factors. But your question about the federal government, the federal government was much more in the housing game in prior decades. And it's been a many-decade process of not being involved. But it would be important to note there are some still very effective federal programs. Section 8, which is sort of rental vouchers, people can take to various landlords. Yes, not all landlords will take them in the same way, but that's an effective program. It doesn't solve homelessness writ large, but it is something that keeps a number of people within units.
Yeah. So, Mr. Mayor, homeless was kind of task one. And while I've heard you say repeatedly, you're not done, and we all know the issue will never go away. It has gone from being these big encampments with 100 or 200 people. You've gotten rid of the encampments. Yes, if you go down the Platte River, you'll see a couple people here and there, and you're working on that. But once you got that under control, and you've obviously gotten under control at a more rapid pace than had been expected, what was number 2?
Yeah, number 2 is crime and public safety. And I would just say, quickly, we view stage 1 of this as building the infrastructure to solve the problem in an ongoing way. We have 1,200 units now. That can bring 1,200 people off the street in 1 year. But if we get to a 6-month length of stay at these sites, so you're up and into permanent housing in 6 months, we can move 2,400 people off the streets and through those units in 1 year. If we get a length of stay down to 3 months, because we're getting folks into housing faster, we have the infrastructure to now move 4,800 people off the streets and into housing every year. So we have built now the machine that, if we get the case management right, could get us to what we would call functional zero, which is street homelessness mostly, if it ever exists, is brief, rare, and non-recurring, right? So if 30 folks come down in their luck in 1 month and end up homeless, 30 folks exit to housing in the same month, that is the status we're after, and I think it's achievable. But on the next one, it was around public safety. And for us, there are 2 parts to that. One is increasing the presence and visibility of officers. More officers on the street is actually the one best intervention on crime prevention that also has the best impact on equity. The way you decrease the over-incarceration of Black and Latino people in our incarceration system is by making sure those crimes don't get prevented in the first place, right? Increasing sentencing actually has disproportionate impact on over-incarceration, but increasing prevention actually undoes both of those. And so we wanted more officers. We made historic investments in expanding our police force both last year and this year. Most cities are all seeing huge declines in their police rolls because of increased retirements and decreased new entrants to the field. So that was stage 1. But the second was we have a number of strategies both focused on auto theft, focused on group violence reduction, on gun violence reduction. We're about 30%
You've dropped auto theft by 30%?
We've dropped auto theft by 30%. We've dropped gun violence by 30%. We've dropped catalytic converter theft by 95%. That's a component of what we were seeing citywide. So we're making great strategies there. But part of the focus in places like downtowns are, how do people feel safe without feeling policed? Right? You don't want the feeling of an officer on every corner with an AR-15. That feels like North Korea. But what you do want is to feel like you could go for a run at 9 o'clock at night as a 25-year-old woman in your downtown and feel safe there. And so we use the analogy of the blue phone system you see on college campuses, where every 100 yards you'd see a blue phone where you could call someone or contact someone. We created these Denver ambassadors, which are yellow vest partners with the Downtown Denver Partnership, who's here, where we have nonprofit partners that are out, visible, walking the streets in a yellow vest. And if you have a question, have a problem, have a concern, if you're in the coffee shop and there's someone who seems mentally unstable in the coffee shop, they are the first responders. They're better at de-escalating a situation like that than an officer with a gun and a badge might be. And it preserves our officers' time to now be able to respond to more serious issues. And so that's both been not just an increase of presence, but a triaging the way you would in a hospital system. Doctor doesn't need to see you when you walk in the door. You have 2 or 3 layers of medical staff that can see you first.
And one of the things that I heard you say in a previous interview was that by closing down the homeless encampments, that has freed up a huge amount of capacity, if you will, in the police force to police in other places.
Totally true. So our officers downtown, before last year, 60% of all of their calls were calls to encampments. 60% of their entire workload was response to encampments. By eliminating that, you've now freed up 60% of their patrol time to be able to respond to other issues, quality of life crimes, other theft, robbery, businesses. And we do now, we call trust patrols, which is we have officers just affirmatively stop in and talk to business leaders and say, how are things going on the block? Anything we should worry about? And they're like, yeah, streetlight's out at the end of the corner. It's a problem every night. Can you get the streetlight replaced? Great, we're on it. So you can now do proactive relationship building, trust building, visibility when you get that time back from having to be responsive to places you can't make a big impact.
And so now you're doing patrols through both problemed areas and then also non-problem areas. Talk about that strategy.
Yeah, so we have 2 parts. One is a hot streets, which is if you have an officer present for 10 to 12 minutes in a location where you have a high propensity for crime, the likelihood of a crime occurring in that site over the next 2 hours drops more than 90%. So we take the 40 intersections at which we have the highest degree of current crime. We schedule patrols where those officers are there 5 or 6 times a day, just for a stop-in, a check-in. Crime is down in those spots 80% from our stop-in. So that's sort of hot streets patrolling. Trust patrolling is proactive outreach to business and commercial centers and residential areas where we can build relationship, build confidence in police, build trust in police, and be able to be present proactively. So we're doing both of those at the same time, and that's where you can use officers' time differently if you take back the time they were using to respond to encampments where they can do very little, because there's people that need mental health support or addiction support or housing. You need a warrant to enter the tent anyways because it's considered a domicile, so they can't actually enter. It's quite complicated and not productive for them. So that time we've freed up, we can now use to strategically drive down crime in other places.
And I think this is an interesting place to think about. There's policing on the one hand, but there's also sort of this sense of security and safety. And I know the business improvement districts, Denver has them, cities all across the United States have really put ambassadors on the street. Now that may not change per se some of these overall crime rates, but it's a perception. And many people in the planning world have heard the famous Jane Jacobs phrase of the importance of eyes on the street, but it really is, it creates a sense of safety when you see more people out there. Now, some of that is a factor of density. And maybe just to give an example here, we were doing an analysis of the future of downtown San Francisco and downtown Oakland about 10, 12 years ago. So the before times. And downtown San Francisco had a lot more crime than downtown Oakland. But there was a perception that downtown Oakland was much less safe. And there's a variety of other things, and some of it is racialized to an extent, but a lot of it's also the lack of density, the sense of you might be 1 or 2 people on a block at one time. And so I think it's important to underscore the importance of presence of people on the street just for that sense of safety, and to some extent might also prevent some crimes from taking place to begin with.
Egon already hit stage 3 of our plan. That is after you get through homelessness and crime, now it's placemaking and activation because the safest street is a busy street.
And that's one of the pieces to your overall framework as it relates to the revitalization of the downtown is don't count cities short in the sense of they've gone through lots of revitalizations over history and don't count them out. Second, proximity, and this is the proximity piece to your analysis. And then finally, don't be too radical on the changes you put in place. So let's hold that for 2 seconds.
Sure.
I'm going to dive into that in a second. But before I do that, to round out on the crime issue, Mr. Mayor, talk about the use of technology and your plate scanning technology, because I think that's been one of the things that's helped you as it relates to dropping down auto theft as much as you have.
It has. So we had a strategy we used at the airport where we had a lot of theft, as a lot of airports do, which are called license plate readers, which seems simple, but that is technology, the camera technology you can mount on light poles or on stoplights that tracks your license plate. So when you call and say, my car's been stolen, and you give us the license plate, we can now scan that license plate on any light camera that it's passed. We know what time you left, what direction you were heading. The problem was we had an inadequate network of those, so we had them just at the airport. We were going to add 10 or 20. I said, what would it take for us to blanket the entire city so we have the full network covered? And they said 111 sites. And I said, great, let's do all 111 sites. So now we did all of those citywide. And so now that means wherever you steal a car in the city, whatever direction you head, we now know where you are, what direction you're heading, and what your last known location was. That means our auto theft team can respond much more swiftly with much better information. We've also done other things like people can install tracking devices, whether that is your own car's activation of its tracking device, or you can do something simple like a tile system for old cars. But that ability to now know where they are is what's allowed us to cut auto theft so dramatically, and we think it'll only get better as we get more of the networks built.
I think this use of technology in this area is so fascinating. I was at a mall near my house down south a year ago, and I was checking out of the Ace Hardware store, and one of the guys in the red apron said, "There's a carjacking going on outside." And I went to the door, and I'd parked my car right in front of the Ace Hardware and saw that my car had been moved from the space right in front of the store about 4 spaces to the right, and it was also sideways, and it had gotten hit. And long story short, somebody had been stealing from a store next to where I was, got into a car, backed up, hit my car, then hit another car. In the process of hitting the other car, the accomplice in it fell out of the car. The driver ran over that person and ended up killing that person, and then they sped away. The reason I tell the story is because they had drones in the sky in Greenwood Village within 5 minutes of when that took place to be able to track the gentleman who had taken off. And I sat there and was talking to the police real time, and there were a couple things that fascinated me. Was because of the cams that they had on their selves, they had the picture of him on an iPhone within 2 minutes. So they knew exactly who it was because they'd seen him driving away. And then instead of calling Centennial Airport to get a helicopter in the air to try and chase the thing, they had a drone that was launched right off the top of a mall near there to start tracking the vehicle.
It's a great example of how it makes it much safer, because in most cities we don't do high-speed chases anymore. So if you're not going to send 3 police cars chasing through downtown Denver to chase after that guy, but then your option is if you don't, they know that and they run because they know you won't chase them. The ability to use a drone to track them means we're still going to track you, we're still going to find you, we're still going to arrest you when you stop, but we don't have to tear up the city in the process by having a Dukes of Hazzard style chase with 4 cop cars running through Colorado Boulevard. And so that I think is a great example of technology creating a breakthrough. It's
quite something. Egon, let me loop back to you on that, on your sort of the revitalization of cities. A, they are resilient, so don't count them out. B, the sense of community and what comes from community. And then the third is don't change too much too fast. Why don't you dive on into that?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I think part of it is, as we look at this moment, and those that have been in the room have been hearing a little bit about this sense of history and where we've come from. But downtown cities have faced major crises before. I mean, cities have burned down in Chicago. Denver's had those issues. Major cities obviously have had earthquakes on the West Coast, boom and bust cycles, high vacancy rates. And throughout the arc of all that, cities have come back. And this is going back kind of generations. And I think it's important, even in the urban planning context, people often talk a lot about decentralization and what happened after World War II. You actually have to go back to the Great Depression and think about what we did in a little period of time during that. In the 1930s, office vacancies obviously went up significantly. Many cities demolished significant amounts of their building to make way for cars, right? We think of automobiles as a post-World War II. Actually, 10% of the office buildings in Chicago, Detroit, lots of places were torn down in the 1930s, in part to make surface parking lots because downtown was competing with other small centers. That was a loss of historic fabric we're not gonna have come back. Now, certainly there might be reasons to demolish an existing building to come up with a higher and better use at times, but the sense that the economic value has totally been eliminated is one I think that we ought to put a little bit of a cautionary note on. So as we think about the strategies going forward, demolition is one we should talk about a little bit.
We'd like to instead demolish surface parking lots.
Well, exactly.
And bring back density and activation.
Yeah, and then so let's talk about the kind of density and activation piece. And I think this is where we think about what's the purpose of a downtown? Why do downtowns matter? Why are they important? They are in a sense an economic center, right? And I know we have seen data and we talk about the data. Most of the people in a downtown are visitors, not workers. But there's still an economic proposition of a place to be there. So downtowns should not cede that. And this is where the agglomeration benefits come from. It's a big word, but idea of being face-to-face is critical for knowledge generation, for innovation. We live in a knowledge economy. People learn from each other. There's knowledge spillover, as it's called. There's dense labor markets. You can hire people from other places, and your suppliers are close by. That goes back 1,000 years as a concept, and downtown's just a manifestation of it. It's been challenged in the world of Zoom, but there is still no duplication of the trust that you generate and you benefit from being face to face. So I think that's kind of a starting point. It doesn't mean you need to be in office 5 days a week, but it does mean you need a center, a connectivity center. And so downtowns are part of that.
Yeah, as you were thinking about your priorities, Mr. Mayor, once you'd gotten, your hand on those first two, and obviously you had a lot of other things going on at the same time. But if you think about downtown Denver, you think about what Lodo has been and is kind of being revitalized to versus upper downtown where we are here. I mean, the Wells Fargo cash registers building across the street was valued at $475 million in 2019. It was appraised last year for $286 million. So almost $200 million of value has been destroyed in that building across the street. First of all, how much of an impact does that have to your tax base?
Dramatic. I'll tell you briefly that just our sales tax alone is down this year. We'll have the tightest budget we've had in 15 years. And the gap in the decrease of sales tax from downtown dropped from 12% of our total to 8%. That total gap is about $40 million of sales tax alone for us. That is about the size of our budget gap this year. So it is directly driving the gap in our city budget year over year is drop in downtown sales tax.
And so as your team sits around and says, how do we get that back?
Yeah.
You're not trying to get Walker and Dunlop to move into the cash register building.
We would actually.
I know.
I would love to talk.
Unfortunately,
this space is lovely.
Unfortunately, I just signed a
available.
10-year lease up in Cherry Creek. But the other than working to try and get corporations to come back, and I want to hear what your efforts are on that. But as you think about those sales tax come from someone going to the dry cleaner down to drop off their clothes. It comes from going to the restaurant. It goes from coming downtown to park to go to a Nuggets game, et cetera, et cetera. What are you doing to try and activate downtown? And one of the things that I want you to jump in on that is talk about the 16th Street Mall, because I know you just opened up a 5-block portion of it.
Yep.
Half of it gets delivered by December and it's fully completed by May. How much are you all banking on the 16th Street Mall to revitalize downtown?
Yes. First of all, we are all in on downtown. I think some people are agnostic about I'm not sure where downtowns are going to go. We're going to sit back passively and watch, eat some popcorn and see what happens. That is the opposite of our strategy. Our strategy is we are all in on believing Denver, and downtown Denver is the economic center of the city. It's the cultural and athletic center of the city. You cannot revive the rest of the city and the rest of the region without reviving downtown. So that's a critical part of our theory. And frankly, it's the biggest economic driver in probably 20 states. Between Chicago and California, this is it. And so we are preparing to make, I think, the largest investment in our downtown per capita of probably any city in America. We're going to put $750 million into downtown over the next 10 years through both the 16th Street Mall renovations and the expansion of the Downtown Denver Development Authority, which was started at Union Station, but would now cover all of downtown. And so that includes a couple of strategies. One is, yes, the activation of the 16th Street Mall. It is the spine of downtown. It's been under construction for 2 years. Many folks haven't, you had COVID, then you had construction of the 16th Street Mall. Many folks haven't come back downtown since 2020 or 2021. They have no idea what it looks like now and how it's transformed. We think the grand reopening of 16th Street gives us an incredible chance to make a new first impression, which is to bring people back and have them remember why they fell in love with downtown in the first place. So we are working on placemaking and activation all along 16th Street so that what you have is the kind of city you often find in Europe where you can walk to downtowns and you can get lost. You can meander through different activations and retail and experiences that make you want to just stay, and whether it's food or whether it's retail or whether it's restaurants or whether it's climbing walls or whether it is activations across the city. So we'll make a deep investment in that with our partnership with Downtown Denver Partnership, who's here, and Courtney Garrett and her team. So we're all in on that. More broadly, we're pursuing this expansion of the Downtown Denver Development Authority, which would give us $500 million to spend to invest in reactivating downtown, which allows us to do things like commercial to residential conversions as part of it, but not the entire strategy. Allows us to attract and retain more vendors and businesses to downtown. Allows us to build public parks and childcare and the spaces you need to make this a permanent neighborhood. We want our business district to not just be a business district, but a residential district. We want this to be a central neighborhood district, which means you do have more folks living, more folks walking their dogs, more folks going to the dry cleaner, more folks taking their kids to childcare. So it's both more eyes on the street, which is about more residents, It's about more commercial presence. And we directly have invested. I mean, we bought the Denver Post building because we weren't willing to walk away from upper downtown. We've kept all of our folks in person because we want to be able to keep our own presence in downtown. We offer all of our employees free light rail and bus passes through EcoPass, so it's easy to get to and from downtown.
It helps when you own it.
It does. Well, we actually don't own the RTD. It's a multi-jurisdictional partnership,
Sure.
so we got to pay like everyone else. We just buy in bulk.
How important, Mr. Mayor, is the 169? I'm swagging that of 40 for the NHL, 40 for the NBA, 80 for the Major League Baseball, and then 9 for the Broncos. How important are those 169 home games?
Incredibly important. And I think one of the reasons why we know Denver is going to be a vibrant city for a long time is we have some assets that no other cities have. We have 4 professional sports teams all housed in our downtown. You find that almost nowhere. We have maybe the best theater district off of Broadway anywhere in the country, all housed in our downtown. We have a great museum infrastructure. We have a great restaurant scene. We now have 4 Michelin star restaurants in Denver. I mean, those things are all will continue to draw folks to downtown. You just have to make sure when they come, the experience is wonderful enough that you come and you stay. Not that you come in, park, and go back, but those are real powerful activations for us. And a retailer on 16th Street would say a Broncos game is actually a 4-day activation, not a 1-day. Because you come in on a Thursday, you stay for the weekend, you spend and invest. So those are critical for us, and they're great opportunities to build around.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say this is something on a national level to put it in kind of a series of Ds. Denver is extremely strong in this. Destinations, you have significant amount. Diversity of uses. And then density. And I think density is something we're working on. I have a question maybe for the mayor, something I've been reflecting on coming to Denver. One of them is distance and size. And as we're talking about walkability in downtowns, ultimately our experience is block to block, depending on where we arrive from. And downtown Denver is actually a reasonably large place. If you imagine you go back kind of historically to places like Florence, it's about a 20-minute walk from one end to the other. And Florence is a small city by today's standards, but the idea of a city center, a downtown, a place of learning, that 20-minute distance is a critical one. And San Francisco, when it did its downtown plan in the 1980s, which was quite important, tried to maintain that 20-minute walk. Downtown Denver is a little bit bigger than that, depending on kind of what direction you're going. So I was curious how you're trying to understand that and kind of what pockets within there to make sure it's a continuous activation.
It's a great point. For us, we're really thinking about downtown as multiple neighborhoods. You know, you still want a lower downtown neighborhood, which has its own brand and identity right now. We want to rebuild an upper downtown brand and neighborhood, just like there are brands across the city. When you look at how do you get to a walkable, bikeable, new urbanist city, I think it's hard to get from where we are to that because you still have folks like me with 3 kids, and wife and I have 2 jobs, and they each have 5 activities, and it's hard to do all that on a bike. But what you can do is create nodes throughout the city of those neighborhood pockets where you might drive to get there, but once you get there, all the activities you do are walkable. So you do, that's what people love about Cherry Creek, is you can walk to work, walk to a restaurant, walk to shop. And even if you don't live there, you drive there to do that. We want you to drive to downtown or to the Highlands or to Rhino to do that. But each of those need to be self-contained activations where you can find that experience what you get there. So that's what we're trying to build downtown to be, is that kind of engaging, enticing neighborhood experience, even in separate clusters that you might come down to and get lost in.
So parking policy, Park One's kind of environments, you want to make sure that's enabled to people.
Yes.
But doesn't that sort of, Mr. Mayor, set up kind of a line, to Egon's point, as it relates to where the stadiums are and walkability? So in other words, if I'm going to a Broncos game, well, and given where the stadium is, it's tough to get a whole lot of amenities there to walk to. But if you think about where the Rockies play and where the Nuggets and the Avalanche play, if you're sitting there saying, let's go somewhere before the game, there's lots within walking distance that attracts people into downtown to go have a meal or go out afterwards. But there is a big delineation line as you move uptown that says you're not going to come and have dinner up here and go down to the Pepsi Center or go across to the baseball field. How do you deal with trying to make this part of the town be as vibrant as the lower part of the city?
Yeah, I think it is the power of placemaking, right? If you think about what Union Station was 15 years ago, it was desolate. No one would go there. There was no activity that would have brought you downtown. We created this Downtown Development Authority, invested in the creation of Union Station as activation. Now it has that beautiful patio and park in front of it. It has fountains, it's got restaurants, and yes, it has transit linked there. But we place-made a spot where people love to come for their favorite places to eat. And a lot of people come there and never go to a game. And so I think there are ways we can place-make. You might not come to Upper Downtown before you go to a Nuggets game, but you might come before or after you go to the art museum, or before and after you go to the Colorado History Museum, or before and after you come to work downtown and then stay for a meal or dinner. Or if you live in upper downtown, where we have a high density of new apartments being built, great neighborhoods, then this would be part of the lived experience here. Is you can still take the mall ride down to the Ball Arena if you want to, but your neighborhood is a series of restaurants and retail experiences. And you have Civic Center Park here, which is an incredible asset we're going to revive as one of the great jewels of the city. So we think there are different activations in different places that you can build around, but we want to make those more permeable. So we also want to make more permeable the connection between what is lower downtown now and what will be the future developments of River Mile and Ball Arena. Where, right, the future of Ball Arena is going to be not a stadium with 50 acres of parking around it. It's going to be commercial and residential integrated on that site. We want to do the same thing with the Auraria campus. So those are integrated, dense, living, working, playing environments, because I think that's how you get connective different neighborhoods across the city that are all vibrant.
But this might be a good moment to throw in a kind of cautionary note here in the well of kind of how do we bring new models to kind of imagining what happens to downtown spaces. And the cautionary note is that in some environments, let's say you want to bring nightlife and entertainment to really happen. If you put too much residential right close by, you actually might shut down that very nightlife that you've sought to create. And so imagining actually areas that can become entertainment zones where there's a different set of rules. It's actually a new policy in California. You can buy alcohol at a bar and walk down the street to other places, but that's actually something that I think we've seen in the activation space of having parties on the street shutting down has been quite helpful in changing the behavior and mindset of people that had not been going downtown for activation. And many cities don't have the 4 sports teams, don't have the convention center, don't have the kind of regional tax for the arts, but that's something you can do. So one cautionary note of, kind of where you place the residential actually matters quite a bit, also in terms of demand for people for supermarkets and other assets.
It's actually a really interesting point, Egon, because we have a loan on a multifamily property in Atlanta, right next to the Braves Stadium. And I was with the owner of that property 2 years ago, and I said, "How's it going?" He said, "It's unbelievable. We've got a line out the door of residents who want to live there, but the churn in that asset is the highest churn of any asset we have, because people get there and they feel like they're living on, in New Orleans on the Strip every single night, because there's so much activity at the ball field and in that residential / commercial area that kids move there, they got their first job, and they're like, well, I might not be able to hold down my first job if I keep having so much fun. And so it's great. They've got tons of demand for it, but at the same time, the churn is significantly high, and it's a very young demographic. You're not getting, older people moving.
And I can tell you examples from other cities of where you might have built a condo tower, and then those people become opponents of other towers being built in their adjacent area. So this sort of NIMBY effect of people that have a strong association with the place that they want it to stay exactly the way it was when they move in becomes an issue. So I think that's a cautionary note of where you place the new residential and the activation. One other point, though, about kind of how do we imagine opportunities of these areas where there's a significant amount of office space. Some of it is the public space and activating that and events and great design. But the other one is actually imagining the insides of buildings, and just to take a page out of Japan, which is a place with significant amount of density, you can imagine a floor being 25, 26 different little bars. They have that in Osaka. There's an old office building. Unfortunately, I heard it might be getting torn down, but there's 2 floors where there's about 40 or 50 unique individual bars. Could that work in the market context? I don't know, but we should be imagining places that bring people inside, that create something very unique. Because that's what's going to draw stuff that you wouldn't actually be able to do in other parts of the city.
Good point. The lobby of this building, when you go through now, has a bar that Troy Guard opened, which we go to frequently, which is a space that was empty before. It's now a way to activate that space that's different. You can do that on the ground floor. You can do that on many floors. We think there are lots of creative ways to use those spaces.
I know that your team had Gensler do a analysis of downtown Denver and try and identify the most likely buildings for conversion. And they came up with, I think it was a short list of sort of 16 properties that were not ready to go, but had the best potential for conversion. What have been some of the thoughts you've had as it relates to trying to stimulate that conversion activity?
We do want to stimulate it. We have the first pilot that is starting around this. We also think we're open to different kinds of housing structures you can create with these floor plates. Sometimes it's hard to have 7 2-bedroom apartments on a given floor, but you might be able to do innovative things around kind of single room occupancy type structures for the 22-year-old who's looking for their first apartment and are willing to have different structures where you might have some shared bathrooms or shared showers or things that could be easier to build around with the current plumbing of those buildings. And so this is one of the reasons why we're excited about the Downtown Denver Development Authority, is that creates resources we can use to stimulate some of these conversions. And also, which I want to talk about, allows us to stimulate those conversions in a way that make those units affordable at the end. Because the other thing you need is the diversity of housing stock that gets the diversity of residents who live in your downtown. Downtown can't be either just for very wealthy people or for old retirees. It's got to be accessible to the 25-year-old server who works at a restaurant downtown to be able to afford to rent downtown. We haven't had that historically. And so this is an opportunity for us to both bring on more residential units, but also bring them on in a way that's affordable. And I think this is our other big bet, is if you look at I literally did slides last night in Northeast Denver on San Francisco and the cost of increase in housing, and what you see as the rate of the increase of housing goes up dramatically. The curve that goes up even more aggressively than that is the rate of increase of the average income of the resident who lives in your city, which is when housing stock goes up like this, average income of your resident goes up like this, right, which means your city is only for rich people at the end of that. And Denver now has actually a faster rate of increase in housing costs than San Francisco does, and a faster rate of increase in accelerating the homogeneity of the income class of folks that live in Denver than even San Francisco or Boston or Austin or New York. And so for us, the real moment is you will really lose what you love about the city if teachers and nurses and firefighters and servers can't live in the city anymore. Dramatically set back our climate goals. If everyone lives 30 or 40 miles outside of Denver has got to drive in, both traffic is worse, climate impact is worse. So our big bet is, like we did in homelessness, look at the total scale of the problem, figure out what's required to solve that scale. We're about 45,000 units short over the next 10 years of affordable units. And so we're put on the ballot this year what I think is the largest affordable housing measure a city's ever proposed. It'd be $100 million a year of tax revenue over the next 40 years. With the ability that this allows us to be a good partner to private sector developers who want to be able to build units that can be affordable, allows us to be either an equity investor or a debt investor into units where we can get deed restricted affordability as opposed to rent control, which is what you do when you have no tools but regulation left. If we can actually bring dollars in investment, we can bring on 4,000 to 5,000 units a year that would be affordable rentals, affordable home ownership, either through down payment assistance or like land lease type structures. And if we do that, you actually dramatically increase the supply, and you increase supply at rates of needed affordability for working families. That both means you have the fastest growing economic engine in the country, and you are still a city where when you drop your second grader off at school, your second grade teacher still can afford to live in the city. Cities like Austin and Denver and San Francisco are at risk of that being, I think, a relic of the past if you don't get aggressive on this.
But I think this is an interesting thing. Where does downtown fit into the equation?
Yep.
And we did some work at Brookings looking at the conversion question, kind of, again, challenging a little bit some of the myths around it, the notion that office is over. Clearly it's not, it's adapting and it's changing. And one of the trade-offs I think is important here is what kind of subsidies should we be putting into this and where? And clearly it's phenomenal. You're thinking about this on a citywide basis and trying to come up with a revenue stream for affordable housing. But I think one interesting question is, let's say you've got some dollars to spend in the downtown. Is it better off paying the expensive cost of kind of reskinning a building and converting it, or just to throw this out to be provocative, subsidizing some small businesses to come in, break a building up into more of a co-work facility, and you have 200, 300 people having their small startups or other environments in a space. So just a notion of kind of, if you have limited dollars,
Totally.
What's the better use of the dollars?
And our answer is yes and yes. Our answer is we want to do both. And actually the beauty is we have actually two parallel revenue streams on this. We'll have the Downtown Denver Development Authority, which is dollars used for all of that commercial activation and placemaking. We'll have the Affordable Denver Fund that could be used for the conversion but doesn't have to be exclusive. So we could do both strategies, which is what we hope.
But Mr. Mayor, on that, a question for you here. I was looking at some of the data that was put together by the study that the University of Denver students did on this project. And one of the things that it highlighted was both Denver's unemployment rate and then job growth rate. And if you look at Denver in 2019 and 2021, it had a lower unemployment rate than the national average, and it had a much higher job growth than the national average. In 2024, unfortunately, the unemployment rate has gotten to the national average, and the job growth number has actually gone negative when the national average is at 1.8%. That says something about the core economy. So as we sit around and say, let's convert this into housing space, it's great and fun, except if there are no jobs for those people to live here, whether it's remote or whether it's in person, we got a problem. What are you doing from an overall economic development standpoint? Because I think Egon's point about, rather than converting to residential, let's try and figure out how to stimulate more economic activity.
Yep.
The numbers right now on Denver aren't great.
Yeah, so a couple things. Agree with you. We do have a couple of benefits going for us. There was a recent study that said this is the hottest job market in the country in Denver, which is highest number of well-paying, well-pursued jobs, but you need more growth in those. Also, of the top 50 cities in America where people under age 30 want to move, Denver is ranked number 2. So we will continue to be a real magnet for talent if we do the other economic development right. So a couple things. One is we want to continue to open up international markets for folks in Denver to be able to access international trades. We just opened a direct flight to
Turkey.
Dublin. We opened one to Istanbul, pursuing others in Dubai. And
have you taken that flight, by the way?
not to Turkey. I have not yet, but I will later this year. So that's one. And that also allows those international companies that are looking to have North American headquarters to open in Denver. We think it's an ideal location for people to have a North American headquarters. You can get to each coast in on a day flight. So that's part one. We're also looking at how we can support growth in targeted industries that we think are well suited to Denver. One of those for sure is tech. We just hosted last week the first ever city convening on AI. It was called the Den AI Summit, which is focused on AI companies that are looking for how you can use AI as a tool for social good. So what is the overlap between AI, innovation, and government, so we can come up with better ways to solve hard social problems, like how you accelerate permitting timelines, for instance, where AI has great solutions that could make this faster for us and for developers. So we'll both look at targeted industries where we can continue to drive growth and expansion, how we continue to attract and keep talent, and how we can open up international markets, both for our own local businesses to grow and for international companies that are looking for North American headquarters to bring here. So we think a big part of this is about talent. As long as we can keep and grow a great talent base in the city, we will continue to be able to attract companies with the natural benefits that we have. But we got to grow and maintain talent and grow and maintain access to markets.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing when we look at the job numbers of kind of what's been happening. I think there's a lot of attention to the last year and the sort of flatness. But if you go back to 2020, there's been growth in Denver, in Seattle, all these places. But we're at this bifurcation where there's a gap between the strength of the economy and the strength of the office market. Because a lot of the industries that traditionally have gone into offices, office-using industries, are the ones, they're digitalized, they're much easier to go remote. So that's been the experience we've been in. So that is a change from the past. And so that's something why the Seattles and the San Franciscos and the Denvers, to an extent, are seeing the challenge in the office space. But that's why pulling back and thinking about the nature of the regional economy and really what's overall driving growth is important. I would point here, we're in the midst of also a massive change nationally towards what we might call the relocalization of the economy. One of the big COVID shocks was supply chain. And that supply chain crisis and a lot of the policy at the federal level has been towards reindustrialization. Now that's benefited some places relative to others, but really trying to bring a much closer connection between innovation and manufacturing. So I think an interesting question for Denver and Colorado is, it's not just tech and the software side, but it's also tech in the hardware side and new industry growth. And that ability to do some design work in the downtown or other adjacent areas, and then do some prototyping and production work in nearby areas as part of your metropolitan economy. We're doing a lot of thinking about that in California. That's happening in a number of parts of the United States. But I think we have to kind of think about where the economy is going. And that's one of the sort of larger shifts towards relocalization. And then you bring in climate before, but the shift to carbon neutrality. So sort of throwing that out there is like, we're actually in a shift economically towards something where we're trying to decrease the carbon input in the entire economy, which is creating a series of massive new industries. And so cities that are in front of that are able to find space for that, I think are going to be very successful. So it's broader than the downtown as part of it.
Yeah, I mean, this is not downtown, but I would put forth that connectivity, DIA.
You're right, I was just going to say.
Go. I mean, it's the opportunity that sits around going from 60 million passengers at DIA up to 100 million passengers at DIA.
Yep.
And then all of the logistics around that. Of all the things that I believe are a hugely untapped opportunity here is the logistics infrastructure around DIA with 100 million people coming through it. Right now it's, and you know better than I do, and Phil Washington's doing a fantastic job of, the whole new rental car parking structure is going to completely revolutionize the space out towards where all the parking lots are right now. But just being able to use that, I mean, it now employs, 30,000 people?
Yep.
I think it's the largest point employer in Denver.
Yep. in the state.
The question I asked for you is Peña Boulevard has become a real bottleneck as it relates to access to getting in and out. When's Peña Boulevard going to get ripped up or not ripped up? When's a new line going to come down the middle of it?
I mean, two things is, first, I would, to your earlier point, put this in the category of incredible assets Denver has that puts us in a unique position, right? It is the third busiest airport in the country. It is the fifth busiest airport in the world. It has 30 direct international flights. And that means you can get access to markets everywhere, right? Like I'm trying to get in and out of Austin next week for an event. It is very, very difficult to get anywhere on the same day. Like that constrains your eventual market growth, your connectivity to the rest of the world. Denver's very well positioned. Dallas is the second, Atlanta's the top, but Atlanta's very different. The other benefit Denver has is not just are we the third busiest, we're the only of those three airports that has three hubs all in its own airport. We have United, we have Southwest, and we have Frontier, which means you have competition and opportunity within the site. Atlanta is essentially a wholly owned subsidiary of Delta, right, which is a different structure. You have different problems to do that. So we think we're incredibly well positioned for that to drive economic growth for the city. But yes, it was built for 50 million. It'll be at 100 million people. That requires some infrastructure change. We are looking at options on Peña. We just had a study of what is possible there in terms of widening. The other thing that happened is we built whole new neighborhoods out by the airport with Green Valley Ranch and Montbello. So now 30% of the traffic that is on Peña Boulevard is not airport traffic anymore. It's people that live up in by the airport. And so that's a different challenge to manage. We do have, obviously, the A-line, which is the public transit connectivity there. So we want to work on maximizing use of that for both airport passengers and for employees. That would relieve a lot of congestion off of Peña. So we're going to come out with some big swing ideas on how we can make it much easier for airport passengers to use the A-line and for employees to use it. And then we'll have to look at long-term, what are the strategies to make Peña less of a bottleneck. I think public transit will have to be part of the solution for sure, an expansion of that and more use of that. But I think we'll also have to look at, is there a need to widen or expand Peña? And those are the two items we're evaluating now.
And given post-pandemic, the decreased usage of public transportation across any mode, you investing there? Or is that one of those things you sort of say, I'm not sure whether people go back to public transit and kind of keep the infrastructure as it is, but don't put new dollars into it?
To Egon's point, I think public transit finds itself in the same doom loop that a lot of downtowns find themselves in, which is people stop riding it. When it gets less busy, it feels less safe. Yeah. When it feels less safe, you ride it less. Then the routes become less convenient, less routine. Now it's less flexible for you, it's less reliable, and then you stop using it. And the worst light rail car is an empty light rail car because it both feels unsafe and it's not worth the money you're investing to do it. So our big purpose, I think you have to have loss leaders here where you chase with getting more people on them first, which then drives more reliability and more frequency. The state has done this some in partnership with us around free August months where you make public transit free for the month to drive up usership. That has been effective. We want to look at other ways we can incentivize more people to use it. We have kids under age 19 are now free. That's been a big driver. We think for seniors, the ability to make it free or low or no cost would be great. The ability to have people that have boarding passes to go to or from the airport to have low or no cost to use it. Employees, low or no cost. That activation of it is going to make it far more useful. And building targeted residential around those transit-oriented development sites. So taking the light rail spots where we do have and creating walkable, livable neighborhoods around those locations, like we're doing in Central Park. There's thousands of units that have come up right on the RTD spot in Central Park, and that's now a walkable way to get your dry cleaning, go to a restaurant, and hop on the light rail and go to work downtown. We think part of that is deliberate city development strategy around how we plan growth.
Well, this is interesting. I mean, in terms of what makes transit work, frequency and reliability are key, and obviously a sense of safety. And we are likely going to have to put money into maintaining these systems. And just to go back, quick sense of history, in the 1950s, we tore up a lot of streetcar lines that had been around for 80 years. 30 years later, in the 1980s, there was a whole move to bring back streetcars. So that's kind of part of the cautionary tale. We have something, we want to maintain it, because transit absolutely can have this downward spiral because of the kind of fiscal requirement from it. But this is also one where land use comes in, because the data really shows transit ridership is driven by your destination, not your origin. And so I think the planning world is really focused on transit-oriented development around housing. Mm-hmm. It's great, we need a lot of housing in walkable areas, but what's going to drive that trip is you get off the train or the bus and you're right by where you're going, whether it's the ballpark, a restaurant, a convention center, an office. And so that the mixture ultimately makes sense. But I would suggest for Denver, I'm curious kind of thoughts here, connecting downtown with these successful nodes. The office environment where your office is going to, is there a nice downtown transit connection between here and
Cherry Creek?
Cherry Creek.
There's not right
now.
Well, maybe would that how would that be as a potential?
But I do think
connection point?
we have I'm glad you said that, because I do think we have an advantage on the destination solution, which is right now there is a place you want to go to if you get on light rail. If you come to Union Station, you walk out of Union Station, you're 2 blocks from the Nuggets, the Avs, the Rockies, from all the great restaurants and nightlife. So I think there are and the convention center. There are destinations to go to. We'd love to have more to go to. The places are now, you have destinations to come from, because right now if you have to drive 10 minutes from your house to go to a park and ride, to wait for a light rail, to take it downtown, to then walk to the restaurant, that's less convenient than just driving the 20 minutes from your house there. So I think that the opportunity now for us is more density around the from locations to drive the to destinations.
And I would put forth, as it relates to destinations, one of the things that if you go to European cities and you land in a major international airport, whether in Amsterdam, whether in London, you can get on an express train that takes you from the very, very suburban, out of the city airport directly to downtown on a bullet in 20 or 30 minutes, straight through. Stockholm's the exact same way. Here, as well as in Washington, D.C. and a lot of other places that tried to connect their airport with downtown, they put these light rails on that A, don't move that fast, and B, they stop 15 times between when you get on them at the airport and get into downtown. In D.C., they put in a train, and if you get on at Dulles Airport, it takes you an hour to get downtown. It's not practical for someone who wants to get to downtown D.C. to get off and hop on public transportation. There's something as it relates to redesigning, like Bellevue Station here, Mr. Mayor. It's got such great development around Bellevue Station because it's got, I think, part of the big drivers of the development around Bellevue Station is because there's RTD there. Yep. The issue with it is you get on RTD at Bellevue Station and it's many, many stops to get into downtown. And so to some degree, figuring out how you get some express lines from real urban hubs to getting people in and out to the spots they want to be at could help revitalize some of that.
Yep.
But
I think you're right. I think it's both speed and it's customer experience on the ride. Does it feel like a train in Switzerland as opposed to a Metro North? Do you have an experience of being well curated, taken care of, and you can not mind 30 minutes of effective reading or sightseeing or others? But I think you're right. Speed is a big one, and I think user experience is the second. And if we make it more convenient to you walk right off the train, you already have a prepaid ticket, and all you do is they shuttle you to and it comes frequently and reliably. Those things all matter together, but I do agree speed is a key part of it.
And speed is really relative to driving, and that's sort of the time competence. One other piece that's
and the
critical,
predictability of it versus driving, because it could be 30 minutes, it could be 60 to get to
But then legibility, because most people don't take transit even in high transit environments. New York is sort of the national exception. And so if there's a barrier to get on, of buying the ticket, knowing where it goes, the signage is a barrier for many people. And so I think a lot of places are doing that. Just to the point of kind of getting dedicated transit lines, I think there's an opportunity here for profound collaboration between cities and districts. And we've seen a lot of challenges all across the country. If a transit district says, we want to do a bus rapid transit line, have a dedicated lane in the middle of the road, and it goes through a series of cities that say, no, thank you, we don't want that. That's going to disrupt our community too much. And that tension and that fight has actually limited, and this is not a post-COVID situation, this is going back a couple of decades, has limited the ability to have more frequent, more reliable transit. So I think a mayor, a city that's really promoting that or championing that, I think can give you the opportunity to work with your transit agency, but also the surrounding cities.
Mr. Mayor, we're winding down here. I've got one sort of final question as it relates to orientation and where you are focused as it relates to development and investment. A number of years ago, when I was living in Washington, D.C., I went to National Stadium and Mayor Vincent Gray was giving a presentation to, I can't remember what group it was that I was there with, but he's standing up and he says, I don't know where development in Washington, D.C. is going to go. And he's standing up and behind him is National Harbor. And here we are at Nat Stadium, National Harbor's literally right over, and I go, just turn around and look behind you, because that's where the growth of DC is going to happen, from Nat Stadium to the south towards National Harbor. If this didn't have a screen behind you and you're standing up and there's an area of Denver behind you that everyone in this room would say, that's where the growth's going to be, where's it going to be?
I think there is kind of a necklace or an arc of opportunities which are on the west side of the city and the north side of the city that I think are both huge opportunities. You look at the Washington Street corridor. If you take the river as it runs north of I-70, that goes into Globeville, Elyria, Swansea, the Stock Show, there are great opportunities for growth and development there. I think the west side of Denver similarly has a whole set of other options for growth and development that are going to be close to downtown. They're going to be affordable. They're going to be vibrant. And there's space there that can be used much more efficiently. I think there's been a lot of build out in South Denver, a lot of build out on the east side. I think the big opportunities over the next 20 years are going to be North Denver and West Denver, and we have some big ideas we're working on. We're excited to roll out not too long on those fronts.
We look forward to seeing them happen. Egon, thank you for your input today. Really, really helpful to have you up here with us. And Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for your perspectives. And by the way, congratulations on a wildly successul first year.
Well, thank you so much for having
thank you,
me.
everyone.
Honored to be here. Great to meet you, man. I have a bunch of questions for you. This is great, man. Thank you so much for doing it.